So I am also very happy to be sort of the last speaker, and we had a very nice introduction to some of these concepts by Stuart and Ian. So in the world of horticulture, the regulatory framework, the PNTs, everything we've discussed absolutely applies. So what I want to do with my talk is sort of color in some of the details in the context of the horticultural industry, sort of discuss the scope and the scale of the industry, who are the players, what are they doing, and what are the unique challenges and opportunities specific to horticulture. But the formal regulatory framework, of course, applies just the same. So like Tyler said, I'm representing Vineland, where I lead our trait development program for horticultural crops, and also Platform Genetics, our spin-off company, which is a trait development and genomic services company. So I'm attacking this from the perspective of a nonprofit research institute, deeply engaged with stakeholders across the value chain. So everything from seed companies to growers, producer groups, retailers and consumers. And from the perspective of a genomics and trait development company that really serves seed companies as its core customer base. So if we look at a general overview of the Canadian horticulture sector, you can define horticulture either by what it is or by what it isn't. So what it isn't is kind of the grains, the oil seeds, the big open acreage crops and your forest timber products. But it kind of is almost everything else. It's all the other plants that we grow for human use. So vegetables, fruits, flowers, landscape sod. It's a lot of different crops that make up this sector. It's a very valuable sector, a $7-8 billion sector at farm gate. And one of the points to highlight is that these are high value but small acreage crops. So this is a key consideration when you think about investments in R&D and investments in biotech for the horticultural space. So you can't amortize those investments over millions of acres. The size of the opportunities might be much smaller compared to grains or oil seeds. I would also highlight the diversity in the sector, many different stakeholders, different groups that have differing opinions in terms of uptake of innovation and sort of willingness to adopt new varieties or new traits, for example. And one of the most important themes is that consumer perception is always front and center in the horticultural industry. The horticulture sector also has sort of a greener hue after October 17th, 2018. So when we became the second country in the world to legalize recreational cannabis, it really sort of transformed the horticultural industry overnight. We now have a most valuable horticultural crop that kind of dwarfs some of the other opportunities. So there's an opportunity here for Canada to lead the world in the safe production of cannabis, R&D, breeding new varieties, the creation of novel products. This is the biggest opportunity sort of in the horticultural sector ever, essentially. So the thing is, though, that this market, this new cannabis industry is really supplied by legacy genetics from your sort of hobbyist breeders. In terms of modern crop breeding, it's about 100 years behind a crop like corn or soybean. So licensed producers, they're really on a learning curve. Right now, the focus has been sorting out some of their production issues, some of their supply chain issues. A lot of the large licensed producers are starting breeding programs, and they've hired smart people. They know what needs to be done, but they quite literally are starting from scratch in terms of plant breeding. So they're starting with some interesting germplasm, but they're 100 years behind. So the interesting part of this opportunity is that, and you'll see how this contrasts maybe with other areas of horticulture, but the R&D and the breeding for the sector going to happen in Canada for Canada, and that does contrast with certain other areas of horticulture. From the consumer perspective, the methods, the ways that these products will be consumed and interacted with maybe creates, and these are just open questions, but Interesting to think of how they'll impact the consumer perception. And in the application of new breeding technologies, are consumers sensitive given the methods of consumption, basically? But what we think is that this is a really unique opportunity to sort of create some novel products and match them up with consumer demands. So if we think about trait development in general in the horticultural space, again, consumers are front and center. So maybe unlike certain other areas of agriculture, it's easier to imagine what a consumer-facing trait might look like. So some of the really obvious ones are attributes like flavor, quality, maybe shelf life and storage once you get it home into your fridge. So these are, I just think, easier to imagine, easier to illustrate in horticulture, sort of top of everybody's list when you think about trait development. But at the same time, there is an opportunity for the more producer benefiting traits to be developed as well. So things like disease resistance, which is an area that I work in a lot, manipulating the architecture of the plant, just different twists on, of course in agriculture, abiotic stress tolerance, drought tolerance out in a field is important. But in horticulture, maybe what that refers to is how is your potted petunia going to perform at retail, on the shelf at Home Depot? So there's some unique opportunities and challenges, like I said, to develop both consumer traits and producer benefiting traits. So we all know there's sort of the whole gamut of technologies for how we can go about creating traits, modifying crops, everything from conventional breeding to GMO and the new generation of gene editing. So it's not my intention to go in any technical detail on these different techniques. I do want to talk briefly about two technologies in particular that we see being applied in the horticultural space. So the first is sort of the mutation-based trait development, mutation breeding, which has really a sort of a wide history of use, 70, 80, 90 years going back, 3,000 varieties registered, created by some mutagenic process according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So the thing, essentially, as we saw from the other presentations, in the EU, more or less exempt from the GMO classification with a couple caveats, and in Canada, potentially subject to the P&T framework, again, depending on novelty more than anything. So from Vineland's perspective, this is a space where we've focused on and we've put a lot of investment in and a lot of effort over the past 7, 8, 9 years. Again, just as a technology that's easily enough applied across a wide variety of horticultural crops with a long history of safe use and sort of minimal barriers to potential commercialization. So we are a nonprofit organization, but we do sort of have this commercialization-driven agenda. And again, just to reiterate, it's a little repetitive, but sort of minimal regulation globally, predictable-ish regulation under Canada's P&T framework. So what we've experienced are that there's, at least it's been laid out, the pathways to exemption and things like, a previous history of cultivation of a similar trait or variation within the bounds of existing variation. So at least pathways to exemption and a clear enough pathway to market. So this is something Vineland's invested in, created a lot of chemically mutated population resources, so using a chemical called EMS, really created a lot of genetically diverse populations. You can achieve mutation densities where you induce thousands of mutations at random in any one given plant, and when you start to get up into populations of 3, 4, 5,000 individuals, you achieve a mutation density where it can approach, say, 1 mutation every 50 base pairs in your population. If your average gene is 1,000 base pairs, there's 20 new genetic variants sitting in your population. So a nice way to create new allelic series, whether it's a total loss of function like a premature stop codon, or subtle alterations arising from missense mutations. So we developed all of these really great resources. This is a non-exhaustive list. And then we basically invented a very efficient way to mine these genetic resources. So to use them from the perspective of what we call reverse genetics and really a hypothesis-driven approach where we would like to identify a gene and ask what variants in that gene can we find in a population. Because we have a hypothesis that if we knock out that gene or if we find a new variant in that gene with a subtle alteration, that it will create a phenotype. So really this is a platform for reverse genetics, for rapid identification of novel and rare genetic variants. It's something that we've sort of perfected the lab and the informatics methods to efficiently mine these types of populations. And this is a patented technology that's issued in Canada, the US, and the EU. So we sort of decided to spin off the company from Vineland, make a commercial go of it. The company is called Platform Genetics. We've been in operation almost 2 years now. And just one thing that I want to highlight in sort of the projects that we've delivered for the clients that we've delivered is that this EU regulatory environment is really what's driving business and driving seed companies to come to us for mutation-based trait development. So the pie chart there is showing that over the last 2 years, about 2/3 of our clients have been European multinationals coming to us for mutation-based trait development, and the showing about a dozen of the crops that we've worked on in service to these companies. I think the list is at about 15 different crops that I've worked in over the last couple of years. So business is going well because of that regulatory environment. So the other technology that I want to highlight, of course, is CRISPR. And by CRISPR, I mean gene editing at large. I'm using it as a shorthand for the many different variations of gene editing and the variation in that toolkit. That there are different versions, but I'm just shorthanding it and calling it CRISPR. So already successfully used in many different horticultural species. Actually, tomato was one of the first plant species to sort of have a published demonstration, so that's going back to 2013 or 2014. And then all of my favorite examples of gene editing in plants are in, of course, they're horticulture, mostly in tomato and mostly from Zach Littman's lab at Cold Spring Harbor, which is where I did my PhD. But there were some really high-profile examples of sort of the power of gene editing in a horticultural crop like tomato. So in one iteration, really it was about making subtle changes and dialing in, edits in multiple genes and dialing in not just sort of gene knockouts, but regulatory variation as well to really fine-tune the yield and maximize the yield of a plant like a tomato. And that's something which, it may excite a farmer if they're getting more yield. It excites me as a developmental biologist. Not sure it would excite a consumer that you've maximized the yield of a tomato plant. Another example from Zach's lab, though, that I think does have relevance for the consumer conversation, and this is maybe not the best picture, but a plant called ground cherry that some of you might be familiar with. It's essentially a sweet tomatillo with a husk. Zach sort of took all the knowledge that they had gained from editing tomatoes and maximizing the yield of tomato plants to basically do a de novo domestication of the ground cherry plant and made, I forget what it was, whether it was 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different changes using CRISPR gene editing to make a new crop suitable for cultivation. So I think that's something that if you think about in a face of a changing climate and a growing population, something that could resonate. We can domesticate, we can create new crops for cultivation is something that can take off. And then on top of that, we can also make it desirable, add the flavor traits, the other consumer-facing traits on top of that. So of course, the catch with the CRISPR classified as GMO in the EU. Just a quick example from my lab. we are starting to explore CRISPR as a tool. So this is just a collaboration that I had with the NRC out in Saskatoon with Pankaj Bhowmick, where we basically we had 2 duplicated genes in tomato, and we needed to knock both of them out at the same time in the same plant. And because we're hoping, again, this is this hypothesis-driven reverse genetics approach that knocking out these genes will create disease resistance. So we were able to successfully knock out these 2 duplicated genes in tomato faster than we would have been able to if we had sort of identified knockouts in both genes and then brought them together genetically. So it is on the radar, but it's still sort of in the phase of it's a research tool. You know, if I want to now commercialize a product like this, I probably am going back to my mutant populations, pulling out those alleles and going the safe route, to be honest, given some of the barriers. But I don't mean to put that in a negative sense. It's just the reality, and I think it's how a lot of people are thinking in this space. But that being said, gene editing has already been sort of applied successfully across a wide range of crops and genotypes. So in this graphic, it's referring to sort of that you're able to edit multiple genotypes of multiple crops. That's an important consideration. You know, doing trait development in the correct backgrounds and in your elite material is very important. So we can see that there are relatively few usability barriers across horticulture. And even in cases where you might have sort of transformation recalcitrant or difficult crops or genotypes, these can typically be overcome with some clever non-transgenic delivery systems. So really there's not a lot of usability barriers. The tools have arrived and they're viable in horticulture. So it becomes more of a matter of how do you use them and how do you bring those products to market. So in terms of how you apply gene editing in plants, the sort of dominant paradigm really is trait development and seeds are intimately linked. It's an integrated seeds and traits business model because the value of the trait is only realized when it's combined with elite genetics. And those elite genetics have all sorts of R&D, all sorts of horsepower underneath them, right? So everything you did in terms of parent selection, marker-assisted selection, whether you use doubled haploid technology, it's really, there's an immense amount of value in the elite backgrounds. So it's really hard to disentangle seeds from traits. The traits and seeds, that's how you make money in the business. So in that context, it makes sense to, even though it may be obvious, maybe this is not at all obvious for some people, but to consider where the plants come from in the world of horticulture and are they even seed crops. So fruit trees, for example, vegetatively propagated, they're really not a seed crop. Really slow variety adoption curve. It can be 15, 20, 30 years for uptake of a new variety. And again, it's not a seed market. Cannabis, the opportunity that I discussed, is currently vegetatively propagated. That's how all of the licensed producers are supplied right now, and sort of heading over the next 5 or 10 years to a modern hybrid seed crop. But there is no seed, there isn't a legal seed market yet. So that's an interesting take on it. Nursery and landscape, again, it's vegetative propagation, or it's a one-time seed sale with a long lifespan, so not a lucrative seed business there. Ornamentals are more of a mix, so flowers, depends on the species and the variety. Sometimes it's vegetative propagation. Some species like petunias really are modern hybrid seed crops with very sophisticated breeding pipelines underneath them. But I would say vegetables, out of everything in the hort space, vegetables are the most advanced, right? They're, for the most part, hybrid seed crops, essentially 100% GMO free, and I'm going to expand on that in a second. But vegetables are where you see the big R&D investments, really high-tech crop, genome sequencing, marker trait association, the whole 9 yards. So in terms of the implications of where these plants are coming from, again, non-seed crops just typically don't have as much technology underneath them. So it's a challenge, but maybe that's an opportunity for new breeding technologies like CRISPR. Again, this I think bears highlighting again that the variety adoption curves can be really slow in certain crops for multiple reasons, whether it's getting through quarantine, vegetative propagation scale up, just the inertia or the risk tolerance of the growers would be another aspect of it, but it's important to the conversation. Again, seed market opportunities may be limited and they may be small. So you might have some relatively high value crops, but there isn't necessarily a large seed market underneath them. And as we've seen, so if regulatory costs can present a barrier to use for technology in crops, in horticulture, that's just accentuated. And just given the size of some of the markets and some of the seed markets, regulation can be expensive, can be a barrier. And you hear people say things like, so if it takes $150 million to bring a transgenic crop to market, you hear people say, well, maybe if it costs 10 or 15 million, that would be okay. But I think in the world of horticulture and the scale of a lot of these crops, even sort of that level of regulatory expense would render the use of some of these technologies non-viable. Okay, just to fill in a little bit more context, in terms of the seed industry landscape, of course you guys are familiar with this, the global seed industry worth at least $50 billion. Don't worry about reading the small print on the left, but basically you guys would be familiar with the trend of consolidation between the seed companies and chemical and seed companies, sort of leaving us with a big 3 or a big 5 players in the industry. So out of that global seed industry, vegetable sales would account for about $10 billion of that. And what you might not realize is that the largest sellers of vegetable seeds are actually the vegetable divisions of Bayer, which now owns Monsanto, Syngenta, and Lima Grain. So you can see those companies all sort of up at the top of the list. So these are very big companies. And even sort of the next tier of companies, your Cicadas, your Rixwans, your Enzazadens, these are huge companies, with seed revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars and R&D budgets that could be 30% of their revenues. So the lack of biotech traits in the vegetable space and the lack of GMOs is not due to the size of these companies or their R&D budgets. It's a function of regulatory costs relative to acreage and the value of the seed sales for any given crop. So again, there really have been almost no GMO products in the horticultural space for the past 20 years. One reason for that is just the way that the plants are cultivated is different. So there is no need for sort of a GMO herbicide-resistant production system in a greenhouse, for example. Controlled environments, eliminate the need for something like that. So that's one reason. You had one high-profile example, the Flavor Saver extended, shelf life tomato that was released in the 90s that ended up being commercially unsustainable for a couple of reasons. Basically unprofitable, but also sort of an early case of consumer backlash and retailers being sensitive to that. What we see lately and recently, there is a new generation of products in the horticultural space. So Simplot, a big potato company in Idaho, has a really nice product called the Innate Potato. It's really a stack or a bundling of traits, some of which would benefit a grower and some of which would have consumer relevance. You see the Arctic apple example, really a nice example of a consumer-facing, consumer-benefiting trait. The non-browning mushroom would be another example, but that one, as we saw, didn't really go anywhere. But sort of an early application of CRISPR in a horticultural crop. So again, this is just sort of this is an anecdote, but it's what you hear from, the CSO of a large ornamental company is again, it's a value versus, you can't spend $150 million to bring a transgenic petunia if the entire crop is worth that globally, right? So it's regulatory cost versus value again. So a collection of anecdotes, I'm actively engaged in research collaborations or serving, through service contracts with many of those players on the list with these multinational seed companies. So a collection of anecdotes on where their head is with respect to gene editing. I think that companies are viewing it, CRISPR and related technologies, right now as a research tool. They're excited about it. They're practicing with it. But again, there may be cases where they'll learn something from a CRISPR experiment, and then their plan for commercialization and implementation will be a mutation-based product. They certainly are thinking about how to use the technology for product creation, and whether that's creating products for permissive jurisdictions, as in everywhere but Europe, or whether it's creating something and hoping that Europe catches up in the long run. One thing that we hear from my collaborators is regulatory inconsistency between the jurisdictions creates some challenges for seed stewardship. They're very much used to that as part of the business at this point, but it nonetheless creates challenges. I think that, again, this is anecdotal, and it's the hope is that eventually Europe will catch up, and that new generations of horticultural products with consumer benefiting traits might be one of the factors that tips the balance in sort of liberalizing the European regulatory environment. Again, everybody that I talk to, they just want gene editing to be another tool in the kit. So, joining all the other wonderful biotechnologies that we can apply in plant breeding, they just think that, of course, it should be part of the toolkit. It's too good to pass up. So quickly then, who's going to bring gene-edited traits to market? If you look at the licensing landscape for the CRISPR IP, it's really been sort of non-exclusive models, and it has led to widespread adoption and democratization of the technology. So what you see is a mixture of large companies and small companies, public sector breeding programs, academia, everybody participating, everybody playing with the tools, creating traits, making changes, creating new varieties. I think just what I would say for context is that those different types of players in this space might have different track records or different capabilities in terms of bringing commercial products to market. So where I think the limiting factors become, again, it comes down to regulatory cost and the impact that has. The other issues would be around grower uptake, consumer acceptance, again, harmonization of global regulatory regimes. So in terms of who will bring the gene-edited traits to market, the US is leading the world and will lead the world. I think they have a particularly permissive regime, and that attracts investment, and that means that they're doing it. In terms of what are we doing for Canada, or who's doing what for Canada, again, the major players, at least in the vegetable world, are these EU-based multinationals, and there's really not major Canadian seed companies breeding new varieties for the Canadian market. So when I say there's little breeding specifically for Canada, I absolutely am not ignoring, the leadership position in wheat breeding and canola breeding and pulse breeding, and all the great work that goes in there. But when it comes to the horticultural world, we don't have Canadian seed companies. We don't have Canadians breeding for Canadians. So what I'm going to show you in a quick vignette here is that we're missing some opportunities to select the best adapted varieties and sort of meet the needs of Canadians through genomics and biotechnology. So just a real quick story about how Vineland sort of views this issue of breeding for Canada. And the story is about greenhouse tomatoes. So in greenhouses, it might not be what you think when you think of sort of, is a variety adapted to one environment or another? You might think, well, it's a controlled environment. It's irrelevant, but that's really not the case. So what this graphic is highlighting, and on one axis you sort of have the amount of light, and on the x-axis you have the average air temperature. And the two circles are comparing basically Leamington, Ontario, the heart of our tomato growing, vegetable growing industry, and the Netherlands, which is sort of the major competitor, the world leader in greenhouse vegetable production. And each of those dots on the circle is sort of an average monthly value for light and temperature. So you can see that there are unique aspects to the climate. So greenhouses are controlled climates, but there's limitations on it. So, you know, in an unlit and an uncooled greenhouse that's vented, you know, a hot summer has implications. So there is a real difference in climate, and it creates an opportunity to breed for adaptation. And what you see, so there's a massive, massive industry centered in Leamington, Ontario. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tomatoes are grown. But it's 2 Dutch varieties that have been used that literally own almost 100% of the market for tomatoes on the vine. And what we see is there's basically a yield penalty, a yield gap relative to what a grower can achieve in a greenhouse in the Netherlands and what a grower in Leamington is able to achieve. So this gap in yield is a real cost to our growers. They want new varieties. So Vineland is trying to step in and provide for that market and give them options for locally adapted, high-yielding, disease-resistant, flavorful tomatoes. But we can see, you know, Canada's an afterthought in terms of the scale. It's a big industry for us, but it's, you know, a fraction of a percent of global tomato production and a fraction of a percent of the global seed market. So this is just quantifying that seed market opportunity. Like I said, even though greenhouse tomatoes are into the hundreds of millions of dollars in Ontario, the seed market for greenhouse tomatoes, and especially for the tomatoes on the vine, these highly productive sort of commodity tomatoes that are grown, it's a $3 million market potentially annually in Canada. So I think that just sort of illustrates the scales of these opportunities, and you see why large regulatory costs could prevent the application of biotechnology. But nonetheless, Vineland has responded to this opportunity with conventional plant breeding, and just by selecting for adaptation to the Ontario environment using our really great commercial greenhouse that we built at Vineland. This is just basically yield curves for 3 of our varieties versus commercial checks. This is at sort of multi-site commercial trialing of our varieties. Basically the 3 top lines are our 3 top hybrid selections, out-yielding the standard Dutch commercial checks by 15% on average across multiple sites. So again, that's just a plug for sort of breeding for Canada, you know, by Canadians, that there's some advantages there. Very, very quickly, Canadian consumer perspective is important here. There's not a lot, so a quick review of the literature. You can find examples of studies where there are Canadian consumers in the studies, and you know, you might get asked about a perception of foods that contain CRISPR or GMO. So the top one is one example where 47% express some willingness to consume. But the willingness to pay analysis in that study suggested that consumers would expect a discount or that they would pay a premium for the conventional. So that's an attitude that might need to be overcome when it comes to the application of biotechnology. Another interesting study from one of my colleagues from Vineland, Alex Grigorchek, really this was a study about communication and word choice and what is the best way to communicate biotechnology in plant breeding. But something that you can pull out of that study is that generally there's a lack of knowledge regarding the plant breeding techniques, and that there's a greater mistrust depending on the increasing use of the technology. So in other words, there's greater acceptance and greater the consumers like conventional bred products more than they like marker-assisted selection derived products, more than they like mutation bred, more than they like GMO. So it's kind of a gradient and an increasing mistrust with increasing use of technology. So that's interesting, and again, this is not an exhaustive review of the literature in this space, but there's absolutely not enough knowledge specific to horticulture and specific to Canadian consumers to help guide our discussions and guide our marketing of products. So to conclude sort of the outlook for gene editing in the horticultural space and the what needs to happen, what's the critical path for success, putting the consumers first, for sure. So developing consumer-directed traits, and then communicating with consumers and having the appropriate messaging of both benefits and risks. This trend of democratization and sort of having wide and fair access to these tools, I'd argue, is already happening, and that should continue. But then the different players of different, with different motivations and different scales need to be supported in bringing these products to market. And sort of avoiding these really serious regulatory costs, which can be a huge barrier for the small crops. Again, the harmonization and regulatory uniformity issue comes up. And finally, just sort of keeping in mind that horticulture is not one group or one sector. It's really, really diverse, and different stakeholders have different views on it. So it kind of has to be customized to the different sectors. So quick thanks to some partners and funders, and I'll take any questions.
I have a question. I may have